back a year ago.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Beer Bound Podcast. Today, we are joined by Horst Dornbusch. Horst is quite the Renaissance man when it comes to beer. He has had quite the career working as a brewer, author, beer judge, and speaker, and is also the founder of Cerevisia Communications, LLC, a consulting company in the international brewing industry. Horst was born and raised in Germany and moved to the United States as a young man. He is a former Fulbright Scholar and holds a BA from Reed College and an MA from Brandeis University. For our Canadian listeners, Horst is no stranger to our fair country, having spent a decade living in Montreal, working as an editor in the special books department of the Reader's Digest from 1974 to 1984. Horst has published hundreds of articles, as well as many books in both English and German, for both brewing professionals and beer lovers alike. Some of his first texts focus on his homeland, including Prost, the story of German beer, published in 1997, Alt Beer, published in 1999, and Bavarian Helles, published in 2000. Horst currently lives in Williamsburg, Virginia, still captivated and driven by his love of beer. So very excited, to say the least, to speak to Horst. Horst, how are you doing today?
I am absolutely wonderful, especially because I can now talk to you.
Oh, shucks.
Yeah, flattering us indeed.
Very happy to have you.
Charming is my fifth language.
Indeed, indeed. Horst, take us back a little bit. Tell us where you are from and your story and how that leads us to beer.
Oh my God, how much time do we have? Okay, let me give you the abridged Reader's Digest version, okay? Well, as you mentioned, I was born in Düsseldorf, home of the Alt Beer. When you order a beer in Düsseldorf, the default beer you get is an Alt Beer. So that was what I knew as beer. And occasionally I also had a Pils. And that's what I had in my bag, so to speak, my intellectual bag or my culinary bag when I arrived in New York City on a hot August afternoon. In 1969, and the first thing I wanted, of course, was a beer. So I bought a six-pack, I opened it up, I tasted it, and I said, oh my God, this isn't beer. Remember, we are now in the late 1960s, okay? So that was kind of a dilemma for me, because now I had two choices. Either I go back home, which I didn't want to do, or I figure out the impossible. I had to figure out, how do I make my own beer? And in those days, there were really no homebrew shops and none of that. So this was really tricky. But I embarked on it. Eventually, I succeeded. So not only was I a legal immigrant in the United States, but I was also already an illegal home brewer, a bloody criminal. I can admit that now because we are way past the statute of limitation. So as I finished my studies and then embarked on a career in publishing and journalism, which was sometimes very stressful, I also kept up my home brewing and branched out into all kinds of different beer styles. So I think I became quite proficient at it. And eventually, after having spent several decades as an editor, a publisher, the manager of a technical publishing enterprise for a major electronics company, I really got burned out and I had to quit the rat race. So I sold my house, turned the cash into stainless steel, and started my own craft brewery. At that time, I was in Ipswich, lived near Ipswich, Massachusetts. And I was my own brewer, my own bottle washer, my own delivery driver. It was a small operation. And I ran that until roughly the turn of the millennium, when there were all of a sudden way too many breweries in the market, and the market for a short period of time started to contract. So I decided to sell out liquidate everything I had. And my wife then suggested I should become a consultant, which I thought was a really crazy idea. But she persuaded me to fly over to the Braubeviale in Nuremberg, which is the world's biggest brew industry trade show. I talked to a few people, and miraculously, I came back with 3 clients, 2 of which, incidentally, are still with me today.
Wow.
So I returned as a bona fide beer consultant in the international brewing industry. And while I was brewing and while I was having a job, I also started writing about beer, which is natural to me because of my penchant for writing, editing, publishing, and so on. So that's how I started writing books. And the first one, as you mentioned, was Prost, the Story of German Beer. That was sort of how I got into beer. And now I am actually talking to you guys, which is probably part of the career building in my most recent profession.
I'm a bit curious just off the bat, maybe the beginning part of your story. And like you said, there weren't any home brew shops. So how did you go about that? Did you just sort of makeshift your equipment for your home brewing? Was it tough to get it going?
I faked it, but there was also a brewery nearby, and I got friendly, and sometimes I did get some malt from them. But I also started in a very primitive way using Blue Ribbon hop flavored malt, 5 pounds of Domino sugar, Fleischmann's yeast, and cold water, and I shook it all up and let it work its way. And I'm sure I produced a lot of diacetyl, a lot of acetaldehyde, the green apple flavor. In other words, I produced a beer that really sucked. But at least, unlike the commercial beers available then, I did have flavor, albeit it had relatively mediocre or maybe unpleasant flavors, but flavors were there. Anyway, so that was my small start. And then I grew with the movement as the homebrew movement started. And I think I became a fairly sophisticated homebrewer, all grain, of course. And
Right.
by the time I returned to the United States from Canada, Jimmy Carter had already legalized home brewing in 1978. So that helped the movement or the sourcing to become much easier.
It's always nice to hear everyone's stories and how they got started. And typically when we interview people on our podcast, they're, chances are they are a home brewer and they always have a really interesting story on how they got started. So it's nice to hear that.
I'm a typical sideways entrance into the industry. Yeah. I'm not an academically trained brewer, but I did read all the difficult chemical textbooks about brewing and so on. So,
Horst, take us back to when you were a kid living in Dusseldorf. So living in a post-war Germany, you're this little kid. Garrett and I both read a wonderful story about you going to your local brewer as a kid and bringing home, I think, like a big jug of beer or a big bottle of beer for your dad. And typically when it got home, it wouldn't be exactly full because someone, not sure who, would have taken a big gulp out of that alt beer on its way home. So tell us about what beer meant to you as a kid, maybe your connection with your dad. What was beer like for you in terms of a cultural identity to your city growing up in Germany, in Dusseldorf?
Well, you see, Germans don't have, if I may put it that way, an anal retentive relationship to beer as is the in some quarters of society in North America. After all, there was such a thing as prohibition, which I believe is almost unthinkable in a country like Germany. I mean, beer was just a natural in my environment, and kids, if kids went out to a restaurant with their parents, the parents would order them a tiny glass of beer, sometimes called something like a Schnitt, a cut, which means it was a tiny glass. But beer was not considered one of those weird things. So when I came to the United States, I was a student in Portland, Oregon, initially at Reed College. And I was old enough to buy beer. So I was the hero of the dormitory because they sent me out to get beer because I,
Because you
in
could.
those days, I was old enough.
Right.
That was something that I found that was very alien to me because, what's the big deal? It's just a beer, man. It's just... So, and of course, when I came to this in '69 into the United States, basically the lack of good beer or beer that I recognize as such was quite a shock to me. It was something that I missed. So that's why I tried to be crazy and see if I could make my own, which was ridiculous, but it worked.
Yeah, Horst, you talk about alt beer, which is the quintessential beer style that comes from Dusseldorf. Can you tell us what that is in terms of how does that differ from what uneducated folks would think about German style beers, which would be more of, say, like a Helles or like a Pilsner style? How does an alt beer different from that particular style of a German lager?
Well, let me ask you a quick question. What was the first lager ever produced in the world? Where, when, and what?
First lager ever produced.
I'm going to guess that it was a Pilsner from Pilsen, modern day Czech Republic.
That beer dates from 1842, and I hate to tell you that is not the case. But we can be sure that the monastic beers of the High Middle Ages were ales. We can be sure that the beers of the Egyptians and the Sumerians were ales. The entire world was driven by Saccharomyces cerevisia, the top fermenting ale yeast, until roughly the Renaissance. Then something peculiar happened. Since the science of genetics has arisen in the last decade of the 20th century, we know that Saccharomyces cerevisia is basically like a landrace. It has only one gene set, its own, but lager yeast, Saccharomyces pastorianus, is a hybrid replicating exactly the gene set of Saccharomyces cerevisia, the ale yeast, and one other set of genes. And it was which microbe had hybridized with Mademoiselle cerevisia to produce an offspring called pastorianus. And people tested that, and eventually they figured out none of the known yeasts were daddies to that new lager yeast. And there are attempts suggesting that new lager yeast arose sometime in the second half of the 16th century, which is when it became dominant in the gene pool or in the brewer's yeast pool, gene, especially Bavaria. How the hell did that happen, and where did it come from? So, in 2011, a group of microbiologists, geneticists, discovered a new wild yeast strain in Patagonia on the border between Argentina and Chile in the Andes, high Andes. That was unknown, so they named it Saccharomyces eubayanus. Turns out, for some weirdly, that Patagonian yeast turned out to be the male daddy of Mademoiselle cerevisia's offspring. Saccharomyces pastorianus had a copy of that yeast, or the gene set of that yeast. So how the hell does that yeast get from Patagonia to Bavaria? And we can only surmise that it must have flown it has been riding on the jet stream, let's say. We don't know that. It certainly wasn't a log or any of that, explorer contact between Europe and America was virtually non-existent at that time. So it must have been something else. So let's assume the jet stream transported those spores or the yeast themselves across the ocean, and they hit the Alps, and they down, and there they were. So we assume that hybridization must have occurred for centuries, but the conditions were not right for those yeasts to become dominant in the gene pool. But around 1350, we have an unusually severe outbreak of volcanic activity around the globe, especially in Indonesia. That lasted until 1850, with a peak in the 16th and early 17th century. We call that period the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped drastically. Winters were very long, very severe, especially in the continental climate of Bavaria. 1516, beers didn't taste very good in Bavaria. So there was that duke who said, henceforth, brewers can use only water, barley, and hops. Yeast was unknown at the time. So that is now considered the beginning of the German Reinheitsgebot, the purity law. Fat Albert, Albrecht V. And that didn't work. Beer was still bad. So 1553, Albrecht passed the so-called summer brewing prohibition. Between April 23rd and September 29, brewers had to find other employment. Were buggers. So brewers could only make beer in the coldest part of the year, the deep winter during the cold, the Little Ice Age in Bavaria. It was at that time that we surmise that the conditions were right for Saccharomyces pastorianus to be dominant, because Saccharomyces pastorianus is a cold fermenter, and he inherited that ability to ferment under very, very low temperatures, even close to the freezing point, from the daddy from the cold high mountains in the Andes. So it was at that point that lager yeasts became dominant in Central Europe, and they spread from there, unbeknownst to the brewers at the time. There were only a few holdouts, regions that resisted the onslaught of making: the Rhineland, Belgium, and the British Isles. Düsseldorf is in the Rhineland. The climate is milder than in frigid Bavaria. So these guys continued to brew by the old method. Is German old. If it were a French beer, it would be called bière vieux, I would imagine. Birra, cerveza vieja, or something like that, depending on the language you want to pick. So alt beer is really old beer. And so the guys in Düsseldorf continued to make it. And in those days, of course, most beers were made with slightly brownish malt, because barley malt was kilned by a direct fire, by smoky direct fired kilns. So they produced mostly brownish malt rather than pale malt. That only happened towards the middle of the 19th century, which is why the Pilsner Urquell, the first Pilsner of Pilsen in 1842, could be a pale beer, because at that point, many people had switched to what's called pneumatic malting. In other words, you heat air with smoke or with fire, and you shoot clean air rather than dirty smoke through the drying grain, and you can get pale malt that way. So that's what alt beer is. It's basically a bottom fermenting ale. However, it's not to be fermented as warm as a typical British ale. Rather, that yeast strain has adapted a little bit to some colder temperatures, so it works very slowly. It produces fewer fermentation byproducts, low on esters, low on diacetyl, and you can age it in the tank, so it scrubs oxygen and other fermentation byproducts out of the finished brew. So you get the alt beer is therefore one of the most clean tasting ales you can buy. And the same applies, of course, also to the Kölsch. which is basically the pale ale of the Altbier, so to speak. So that's what Altbier is. And I grew up on that. That was beer for me.
Had a few, and it's very hard to find in Southern Ontario. So when you do find a good one, they are very, very tasty.
Because you're in Toronto.
Mhm.
Have you had the Creamer Springs Alt?
I think so, yeah.
I showed those guys in Düsseldorf. I took them to Düsseldorf. They paid me to do this. I
Wow.
showed those guys how to make Altbier at the Zum Schlüssel Brew Pub, which is one of the 4 Altbier brew pubs in Düsseldorf. And they even, I wrote a contract in both languages for them to sign so that they could take the original Zum Schlüssel Altbier yeast with them to Creamer Springs to make their Altbier. So that is really a replica almost of one of the authentic Düsseldorf Alts in Creamer Springs. So,
Of course, that's so amazing. I've never heard that the yeast strains, they came all the way from south, like very far in South America, all the way up to Central Europe. That blows my mind. I can't even believe that.
the
Remember
geneticists are not wrong. They know how to identify this stuff.
Yeah, no, I
And they have
believe it,
not
but
found- And they have not found any other candidate. But what they did find was there is a small patch of forest in Wisconsin where they found Saccharomyces eubayanus in the wild. They found a small patch in, I think it's the northern northern island. I'm not too sure. I think it's the northern one of New Zealand, and they found several strains of this yeast, also this wild yeast in Tibet. So obviously that little microbe has been riding not the waves but the winds throughout the entire universe, it seems. But it apparently it never managed to find a willing lady yeast with which to mate and create a hybrid offspring, as it did in Bavaria, where Mademoiselle Cerevisia was obviously able, willing, and available. She was so cold, so she said, "Okay, let's do it." And there you have lager yeast in Bavaria.
It was fate. And it had to end up like that.
That's right. Star-crossed lovers, if there ever were. Well,
That's
Horst, so when you were growing up in Dusseldorf, suffice to say that when you went into a bar or you were going to purchase beer, your default beer in Dusseldorf, say in the 1950s, was an alt beer.
Yes, it was almost the only beer available at that time.
It was the only one. So you couldn't locate other style. You couldn't find Bavarian Helles, Oktoberfest styles that wasn't available?
Not to my recollection. If it was available, I certainly wasn't looking for it because I just didn't think about it. And also, I mean, I didn't see it around me. Maybe there were specialty outlets where you could get it, but it never occurred to me to drink anything but alt beer while I was there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Horst, you arrive in the United States in the late 60s. So you said you were quite taken aback by the difference in beer that existed in the United States, as well as the cultural identity that beer had, the restrictions that associated itself with alcohol as well as beer. You couldn't homebrew. That didn't become legal until about a decade later. What were the big differences that you noticed in terms of the styles? What was an American beer like in the 1960s that really threw you off?
Well, first of all, my type of a culture shock, for the reasons indicated, might have been slightly different from the normal culture shock of a normal immigrant. You know, if it's New York or Montreal, it's all the same. It's very different from most parts of Europe, that's for sure. If you want me to characterize American beer at the time, now I have the vocabulary that allows me to maybe even insult those brews, but I have since learned that these brews, even though they are very unassuming, they're actually very difficult to make. I now know what adjuncts are. I know that what it means that something is made with rice flakes and corn flakes or corn syrup or whatever. But they were so light and flavorless that, just like with the Helles, the Bavarian Helles, if you make a mistake, then they are almost undrinkable. So it's really, there is a fine art to making a Bud Light or a Budweiser, but it just wasn't something. It was a taste experience that I had trouble associating with beer. And so basically, in simple language, there was no beer in America. Or even when I went to Canada for the first time, you guys up in the frozen north up there, you didn't have any beer either. So that was a desert.
Molson Canadian or Labatt 50?
Labatt 50, Labatt Bleu, Molson, Brador, I thought, was perhaps the best beer that was made in Canada at the time.
You went about you went through your criminal path to doing home brewing. So how did you source the material? Were you able to find malt that had the same consistency that you could find in Dusseldorf, or did you have to find the next best thing? Did you have sort of a hybrid, something close enough that you were able to use in order to brew what you were looking for?
Well, initially, of course, I took what I could get. Initially, I didn't even know that there were different hop varieties. If you know a friend who works in the brewery, which I did, so he gave me hops. It was just hops. I didn't ask what variety, where does it come from. It probably might have been Cluster, who knows, Chinook, whatever. Or maybe American-grown Tettnanger or American-grown Mittelfrüh. I had no idea. I just threw it in there. Those were the years of innocence for me. But later on, of course, especially during the 10 years I was in Montreal, there was a great homebrew shop on Rue Sherbrooke. And that's where I all of a sudden were able to find a greater differentiation of malts and hops. And so I could play around with them. And I figured out how to make stouts, porters, brown ales. But of course, there was nothing really, you couldn't make anything authentic that would be called an alt beer. That alt beer was not a style for which the homebrew supply chain was geared. In other words, you couldn't make it. But that changed, of course, in the 1990s when I started my own brewery. Mm-hmm. I made my flagship was a Dortmunder export. Then I made an alt beer, Weiss beer, Bock beer, Schwarz beer. And at that time, you could get all the right ingredients. And there were several competing malting companies. I think initially I used Breeze, and then I switched to Weyermann when they entered the market here in North America.
So in 1997, Horst, you wrote Prost, the story of German beer. Why did you decide to write a text showcasing the macro identity of Germany? Because obviously, as you know more than Garrett or I, that Germany is a very complex country with many different parallel histories running beside each other. You have different countries. You have basically parts of Germany, but at one point, different countries, different nations that have different histories. So why did you go about focusing particularly on Germany as a whole instead of, say, the Rhineland or Bavaria or Prussian history, something like that? Why did you focus on the entire nation?
Once upon a time, Germany was basically one culture with regional variation. From a publishing perspective, at the time, there were already a lot of homebrew books on the market. There were books about English ale. Roger Protz was very prolific. Mike Jackson was prolific, so on. But I felt the German beer culture as a whole, with its tradition going back all the way to the Celtic tribes, actually, and we have evidence for all of that, archaeological and later written, because the Romans invaded Germany and they were literate, and so they reported about that nasty habit of the Germanic tribes making beer that tasted like rotten wine. That's what Tacitus said in the 1st century AD. So there isn't a long history. We know all about the monastic history in the High Middle Ages. St. Gallen in now Switzerland. I mean, there is rich beer history. In English, you could only find books about the equally rich Anglo-Saxon history, and craft brewers were making basic English stuff. So I thought there is a real niche where I could step in and use what I sort of accidentally knew because I grew up back there to contribute to the knowledge of beer styles in the North American craft brew movement in a way that others perhaps could not. And then, craft beer moved out of the British sort of, if you wish, cage into Belgian ales, sour ales. They started to branch out, extreme beers. The IPAs became and aggressively hopped and so on. And I think eventually North American craft brewers also started to look at German beer styles. And I think a lot of them have read some of my books, which have guided them to do so. And I'm confident that that's so because of the press run figures that I happen to know. Somebody must have bought and read that stuff out there.
So, Horst, can you tell us where the foundations of German style beers come from? How far do you go back in your book? Where does the profound relationship, the love of Germany and beer, where does that begin?
German beer probably does not go as far back as the beers of Iraq, the Sumerians, or the Babylonians, the Egyptians. Probably not. And it's equally unlikely that beer making in Germany was influenced by those older beer cultures. It's not necessarily true that that culture migrated from the Middle East into Central Europe. It's more likely that fermenting extract from grain was something that evolved in many, many different locations around the globe, including in Latin America and in China. And the tribes inhabiting the deep forests of Central Europe in antiquity, they had figured out how to malt and ferment grain extracts. The oldest archaeological evidence of beer making in Central Europe is an amphora that was found in a Celtic chieftain's grave, and it has been dated to roughly 800 BC, and it contains residues of a black beer, and that urn or amphora was found near Kasendorf, which is a tiny village outside Kulmbach in what is now northeastern Bavaria. So the Roman historian Tacitus, he wrote about beer making among the Germanic tribes, and the legionnaires in the 1st century AD. A lot of them were fighting tribal aggregations, Teutonic, the Cheruskis and other Teutonic tribes in the Rhineland, basically, where I was born. And so it's Tacitus who writes in great detail about those nasty habits that those drunken, unruly Germans practiced, and beer drinking was clearly one of them. And so if we assume those tribes over the centuries never stopped brewing, I would even argue that my hometown beer is maybe one of the oldest beer styles in the world, with roots, unbroken roots, probably from the beginning of our current epoch. The alt beer of today has nothing to do with what those guys drank around the time of Julius Caesar, but still there's seemingly an unbroken thread that you can pursue with great improvements along the way, I hope.
For sure. It's always good to see, or at least, hypothesize about history through the ages, or sorry, history of beer through the ages, how it's evolved, and obviously that's a big point for us in our own business. It's always great to get that perspective from others. Well, Horst, given you seems like you've done it all in the beer industry in a sense, right? You've homebrewed, you've started your own brewery, now you're into the consultancy. You've seen a number of things in the beer and brewing industry over the years. Right now, Andy and I, as we still frequent our local brewers, we tend to see sort of a little bit more of the classic traditional styles, let's say traditional European styles. We're seeing more Helles, we're seeing alt beers now. All these styles that, maybe to your point, when you landed over here in North America, were non-existent. And obviously the craft beer movement had a lot to do with how beer styles evolved. So, in your own experience, do you see that maybe this is another sort of movement, this reversion back to traditional beer styles, in your own experience in a way?
Here's the interesting part, I think. Making beers to styles is not easy. There is such a thing as brewing science, and you can get a PhD in brewing science from many reputable universities around the globe. It's also true that you can take a bunch of brawny chaps, give them an apron, and a little cooker and a paddle to stir, and you throw some malt at them, and they stir the mash, and they make some good stuff, but it's just haphazard. And maybe that's what the Germanic tribe did way back then. So,
True.
in other words, I think beer styles require sophistication in terms of knowledge. They're knowledge intensive. They require sophistication in equipment. There are certain beers that you couldn't make with a single infusion mash system. So as malting techniques, equipment engineering, the power behind brew kettles. I mean, we moved from direct fire kettles to steam heated kettles and so on. Also, we increased our microbiological knowledge of yeast. We understand the biochemistry of hops, how to isolate or how to extract components in hops, how to avoid diacetyl, how to off dimethyl sulfate to make it not taste like rotten eggs. And also, we have learned so much, and the science is pertinent to the raw materials and processes exploded in the 19th century. Before the 19th century, people thought yeast was not an organism, but the product of fermentation. That's why chemists and not biologists dealt with yeast. The first person to really claim that yeast, or demonstrated that yeast was a living organism, was Theodor Schwann, 1835. He called it Zuckerpilz, and that's the German word for sugar pills of sugar fungus, which in Latin is Saccharomyces. That's how that name evolved. And in those days, they had no clue that there were even different strains of yeast that had to wait for Christian Hansen to start isolating different yeast strains around 1890 or 1880 in that period in the Carlsberg lab in Copenhagen. So the 19th century essentially was the Belle Epoque of beer style creations. Before the 19th century, there were really only local beers that were haphazardly made because of the ingredients that grew around the brewery. Starting with the 19th century, all of a sudden, because of science and engineering, the Industrial Revolution, and all that entails, all of a sudden you got dark beers, light beers, strong beers, weak beers, and the diversity of flavors increased and became codified into distinct styles. The Märzen evolved, 1841, the Pilsen 1842, the Oktoberfest beer, 1870s, thereabouts. The mid-19th century, in Düsseldorf, the Altbier evolved around 1850 as a codified style. The Kölsch evolved only in 1918. The first bottle labeled Kölsch was put on the market in 1918. People forget that beer styles are a relatively recent phenomenon, and therefore also a very recent term, because it was Michael Jackson who first started calling these things styles, like architectural styles, musical styles, styles in poetry and literature. We have styles in beer making. That didn't exist before the 19th century.
Or I guess looking back, right, it's hard to define anything, but now that we have those definitions, I guess it's a good thing in some senses, but maybe it doesn't capture the whole picture.
Right. And now brewers are able to learn all about the elements that flow into making a particular beer style, and they can control the ingredients and the processes to achieve that. In years past, that may not have been that easy.
Horst, you write in your text, you say that German and English style beers are the gold standard for beers in terms of variety, complexity, and quality. Why do you use English beers and German beers above, say, the other countries in the world that do have profound beer cultures, such as maybe Belgium or the Czech Republic? Why Germany and why England?
You can take Germany and England, let's say, as shorthand, as short forms or as handles for basically the British Isle, Anglo-Saxon beer culture. And I would include into the German beer culture the Czech Republic, Austria, parts of Scandinavia. But, I don't mean that as, let's say, an imperialist political term. And if you go to Belgium and northern France, they're a little bit like the Rhineland. There are sort of ale residues. They make also funky beers. But these two cultures, this culture in Belgium is kind of influenced by both the British and the German culture, and has created its own mélange, its own mixture, its own melting pot, if you wish, of techniques, both ancient and new, which of course is a culture of its own. But I think in a more purist definition, you get I think the German in the wider sense and the British in the wider sense beer culture with its ingredients and processes are much more easily defined, whereas Belgium is, the guy who used to be the Burkhardt is his name, who used to be the brewer at New Belgium. He said, "I love beer, but I hate styles." He's a Belgian. So he didn't think that styles even existed. That, I think, to me, typified the Belgian beer culture. And if culture is defined as something that's regularized, he was being so individualized. He just makes beer. Every brewery makes a beer, never mind styles. The other cultures sort of gravitated more towards a regularized set of processes and ingredients that were then adhered to over maybe even centuries, so that styles could emerge as something very organic, whereas Belgium is more individualist and funky, thus not quite the same. It's not better or worse, but it's kind of conceptually even different than, let's say, the German and the British culture. At least that's my subjective view. I would not want to be dogmatic about that.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that definitely makes sense. And obviously it's not as you pointed out, it's not a political take. It's more of a geographical assumption, because you do include the Scandinavian countries and parts of Czech Republic, of course. So I want to move on, Horst, but I want to know your take on, you obviously touched on the 19th century industrialization changed the entire world. It allowed us to brew at capacities we were never able to do prior. Why did the lager just dominate? Why did it take over the world that we see today in the 21st century? Because if you look at ales, were still primarily being produced by the global dominant power of the day, Great Britain, obviously shipping their ales all across the planet. But we see into the 20th century and the 21st century, macro beer, which is by and large all the beer that most people drink in terms of numbers, it's mostly all lager, a lot of it being your typical Pilsner style lager. So why did that win? Why did the ale become the big loser in the 20th and 21st century?
The honest answer, of course, is I don't know. The dishonest answer, or the speculative answer, is I can take a stab at this. Yes, you can make dark lagers, of course. Yeah, I can make a dark lager as pitch black as a stout. A Schwarzbier is one of them. It seems that beers like this one, to some people, might look a little bit more elegant. I don't know that. It's also true that flavors that are more assertive tend to be less universal in their acceptance. Lagers, because of the way they are made, where the yeast stays in the beer for maybe 4 weeks, and it takes out a lot of oxygen, a whole bunch of other chemicals that it reabsorbs them for its next life cycle when it gets repitched. It knows that. So there are so many fermentation byproducts, some with a taste threshold of 1 per billion that we can taste if they're in there. But if they're not in there, the beer goes down so much more easily as a quaffing beer. You see, you wouldn't quaff a cognac. A beer is that classic quaffing beer at 5% and not 11% extreme IPA, double, triple IPA with, whatever. There are other beers to sip, or other alcoholic beverages to sip. So I think lager has a longer shelf life. It might appeal in its gentleness, unless you create a lot of unpleasant, cloying residual sweetness, which you can avoid. So its gentleness and also its color may have created an association being more elegant, perhaps, and also more palatable to more, the greatest good to the greatest number of people. That is the best fitting beer for the greatest number of people, and it looks elegant, especially now that we have glass. Remember, the beer stein got replaced by glassware in the 19th century. So all of a sudden you could see what's in the glass, and if it was murky with floaters, that didn't look very great, so you wanted to filter it. And the filter was invented by Lawrence Enzinger in 1878. That's how long it took. Refrigeration, 1872, von Linde, Spaten Brewery, right? So you can see how all this converged to make a new beverage called beer that had that gentle taste and maybe an aura of elegance. I don't know this.
It's a great theory, pleasing to the masses,
Yeah.
right?
You asked me, so I can sit here and say I don't know, and then we are silent. But I gave you something to think about.
That was a pretty good I don't know answer.
Damn good answer.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of reasons. I mean, I've studied this question quite a bit, and there's not a single answer to it by any means. It's complicated, and there's a lot of different facets to it. I think a lot of it has to do with exactly what you said. The shelf life is longer, and probably in warmer countries, it's not so nice to sit on a beach or be working a hard day in a factory in South America or even in Southern Europe and be drinking fruitful, high alcohol ales as opposed to some nice crisp lagers? I don't know. There's a lot of different answers, I'm sure, and I don't think we have time to get into all of them. But I want to, Horst, I want to talk about, you obviously have history in being culturally associated with beer, a particular style of beer being alt beer, as we discussed. And then you get into actually brewing, being a brewery owner. I want to know how you experimented and learned to create different styles of German beers. Obviously, as you said, when you were a kid, beer was by and large what we know today as alt beer. There wasn't that much variety in terms of what you had available to you. So how did you go about learning about different German styles? Certainly enough to go on to write a book about, for example, the Helles style beer.
There are brew science, that there have been brew science programs, university brew science programs for a long time. A lot of them, a lot of the brew universities were in Germany. Weinstefan, VLB. There were also, there's the Catholic University of Leuven. There's one in Scotland. Was it Harriet Watts or something like that? So, and because a lot of the technical brew literature is in German, I could read it. And some of these books also have nifty diagrams about brew systems. So I went to a friend of mine who was a metal worker. He had a metalworking shop. And I asked him to bang out a little mash tun, a little brew kettle, 5 gallons or 20 liters. So I basically created a Lilliputian replica of the brew systems described in those German university textbooks. And they enabled me to make beers that most people who have a simple setup, one of those old style, a plastic bucket, and you know what I mean. So I guess on the equipment side, I became more sophisticated than the ordinary brewer because I could read the instructions that in those days were not available in English. And then, of course, if you follow up a little bit, then you read about Schwarzbier and Weissbier and Bockbier and Berliner Weisse and the microbes that go into Berliner Weisse and so on. And it just follows from there. I think it was access to literature that I purchased whenever I went to Germany. I brought back beer books, textbooks, brew scientific textbooks. So that was my bedtime reading.
It's great bedtime reading. Horst, how up to speed are you with what beer is like nowadays in Germany, say in Dusseldorf or in different parts of the country? Obviously, you mentioned a word that Garrett and I will butcher if we say. The Reinheitsgebot is the purity laws from 1516, which gives a bit of a stereotype to Germany even nowadays, that you're very, very traditional in its brewing ways. And obviously now living in the United States and having lived there for many decades, you're aware of, into the 21st century, just how a new era has begun, certainly in North America, that is this craft beer scene that exists today. Would you say that Germany still has a very traditional sense in terms of its identity connected to beer, or it's opening up a little bit to the experimentation that seems to be in vogue nowadays?
Before COVID, I spent between 6 weeks and 3 months a year in Germany, dealing with clients. And sometimes I also do test brews at client facilities over there. So I'm somewhat familiar with the beer scene there. So you mentioned the Reinheitsgebot. That is actually a bloody misnomer. A German beer is not necessarily pure because of the Reinheitsgebot, and it's not the beer purity law, because law in German means Gesetz. Gebot means commandment, like the 10 Commandments. So this is the German purity commandment, which is basically mistaken by the general public as a guarantor of purity. I tell you, I can make a crappy beer perfectly in conformity with the Reinheitsgebot, and I can make an absolutely wonderful beer that violates that Gebot 100%. So purity is not really the gating item. However, culturally, because Germany is an ancient society with an ancient culture that has grown since the tribal days in antiquity, it has social mores and habits and cultural events like Volksfests and all of that that are deeply ingrained in the social fabric. Whereas North America is a relatively young society, go west, young men. It was the slogan. We are adventurous. We go out, we do things, we challenge things, and we look for boundaries. We try to go beyond the boundaries. Okay. Whereas the cultures in the old world are much more settled, much more. So social change happens very slowly. It's rare to get a cultural revolution in the old continent, on the old continent. Whereas here, it's sort of a built-in premise almost that you seek out something new. Thus, I see only a very, very slow acceptance of some of the North American beer styles, like the IPAs, over there, or even stouts. I mean, German brewers just 10, 15 years ago said Belgian beers come off the bottling line infected, or Belgian beers aren't beer. That's not beer. Now, if you start from that plateau, from that level, getting to an IPA with 80 IBUs and 12 different hops added every 10 minutes to the kettle, that's a long way for them to move. And even if the brewers want to make it, the consumer will not buy it.
Right.
They reject it. So there is that building concern. I think that, I don't know if that's the answer to your question, if that's what you were asking, but I think there is something positive though. Sometimes you have fads in North America. They come up like, some funky sour beer, and everybody has to make a raspberry banana sour with Brettanomyces and lactobacillus. And right now we got Quake yeast from Norway being the latest fad. Maybe the more conservative beer cultures, when they adopt something, it is something that has staying power. And maybe, something that is overloaded with Simcoe hops, which gives you that cat piss component. That may be interesting to try. You get a cognac snifter and you taste it, but that's probably not going to be a beer that has the staying power of a Pils or a Helles or a Schwarzbier or a Doppelbock or a Dunkel or a Kölsch Altbier, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's fair. There's a lot of change going on this side of the ocean that I think maybe people are a little more receptive to. But even then, like, they come and go really, really quickly, right?
Yeah,
And
it's almost
like
too
anything
fast.
has really stayed here. IPAs, I guess, maybe as an overall, but the variations in it, like you were saying, Horst, like the fads, they come in and out. Milkshake IPAs is the most sour beer you could possibly produce. Those have all kind of like come and then gone and come and then gone. But yeah, no real staying power.
Well, Horst, we're coming up on our hour mark, so we obviously want to be respectful to you and your time. We've really appreciated this conversation, but I think our last question or comment to you rather is there anything else coming out in terms of your fine literary career? Are you working on any other books or projects that relate to German beer or just beer in general?
Yes. I'm now working with my friend Thomas Kraus-Weiermann. He is the technical head of the Weiermann Malting Company in Germany. We have done several books together. And we are now working on a new online compendium which is actually almost at the beginning, it's almost like a brewing course, which is sort of like a bridge in terms of complexity between a brew scientific textbook and just simple homebrew instructions, stir the mash and don't burp or something like that. Followed by explanations of ingredients, processes, and we hope about 200 recipes spanning reconstructions from antiquity to the most avant-garde modern beers. And we hope to come out with this thing this fall on the occasion of the next Braubevian in Nuremberg in November. And it will then be online, only online, to download against the modest price after that. And that's what I'm working on with Thomas right now. Our conceited view is once you've downloaded that book, you don't need any others anymore.
Mm-hmm. The Bible. Mm-hmm. Very, very good. Well, Horst Dornbusch, thank you very much. Obviously, we said in the introduction, you are a beer renaissance man. I think that's an understatement. We really appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully we can connect with you in the near future, maybe to explore a little bit more of your knowledge and expertise. I think Garrett and we would be honored if you'd be on again in the near future.
It was my pleasure to talk to you, and I would be more than happy to join you again one of these days. And
Thank
maybe next time I come to Canada, I'll stop by in Toronto and we do it in your studio.
You let us know. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Horst.
Bye.
Thank you, Horst. Take care.
Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all our interviews and beer-related content. Remember, craft beer is here.